They buried my husband with my $4 million ring on his cold, folded hands, and I heard one of them whisper, almost laughing, "She'll never know." Those words cut through the chapel air sharper than the winter wind that slid in every time. Someone opened the door, and even now, weeks later, they echo in my kitchen like a draft I can't seal. I am 82, and people assume age softens everything. Memory, suspicion, clarity. But that moment sits in me like a stone under the ribs, refusing to move or dull. I remember the way the fluorescent lights in the preparation room flickered, how the scent of lilies, too many lilies, made my eyes water before I ever had the chance to cry for him. And I remember how the young funeral attendant, the one with trembling hands and too polished shoes, avoided my stare when he slid the casket closed, as if he feared I might demand it opened again and find what he and someone else hoped I'd never look for. I didn't tell them that I knew exactly what was on his finger, that the ring wasn't some careless trinket or sentimental ornament slipped on as a gesture of devotion. It was mine, my investment, my insurance, my one reckless purchase after a lifetime of counting pennies and cutting coupons while everyone else spent my steadiness as if it were endless. $4 million, earned not from extravagance, but from decades of discipline, of packing lunches for a husband, working double shifts, of hemming my own dresses, of never traveling where others took vacations, of buying one good thing in my entire life because I wanted to leave something behind that couldn't be swallowed by people who mistook my gentleness for stupidity. When we bought that ring, he joked that if anyone buried him with it, he'd claw his way back out to scold them, and we laughed until the waiter refilled our glasses. It was a memory full of warmth, but on the day they dressed him, too pale, too still, too much like a stranger borrowed from another family, I could hear only the bitter irony of it. People moved around me that morning, like stagehands in a play I hadn't agreed to perform in. My son barked orders into his phone about the seating chart and the catering. My daughter-in-law, with her impeccable hair and her insincere sympathy, kept touching my arm as though guiding a confused old woman who might wander somewhere embarrassing. She spoke in those clipped, sugary tones reserved for toddlers and patients with memory loss, reminding me where the restroom was, telling me when to sit and when to stand, warning me gently not to overexert myself today. I let her think she was directing me, because I learned long ago that nothing unsettles people more than a quiet older woman who listens without interrupting. They think silence is compliance, but it's really observation, and I saw everything that day, every glance, every murmur, every too quick movement near the casket when they thought my eyes were downcast in grief. I was grieving, yes, but grief hasn't made me blind. If anything, it sharpened my sight. I noticed how the funeral director kept adjusting his tie, wiping his palms against his jacket, as though guilt were sweat gathering under his collar. I noticed how my daughter-in-law followed him into the preparation room when she thought I was sitting in the front row with my head bowed. I noticed how long they stayed behind the door, long enough for me to hear whispers, the scrape of something small against metal, the hushed, hurried tone of people doing what they must finish before anyone comes looking. When they emerged, she was smiling too widely, and he was blinking too often, and I, old as I am, know what that combination means. I remember standing beside the coffin after everyone else had gone outside to fuss with umbrellas and gossip about the floral arrangements. The room was too quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies the smallest sound. I touched his hands, cold through the satin gloves, and I felt a strange hollowness under my own skin, not just because he was gone, but because I knew that something belonging to me, something representing years of sacrifice, was gone too. I didn't need to see the ring. The space where trust used to live in my chest was suddenly vacant, and that told me more than my eyes could. Still, I looked, because truth deserves witnesses. His fingers were bare. They tried to hide it by folding them neatly, but death stiffens everything, even deception, and there was a faint indentation where the ring had sat for less than an hour. When my daughter-in-law reappeared, she touched my shoulder with a rehearsed gentleness and said, "He wanted to go with it. It was his wish." I turned my head slowly, and I studied her face, the delicate makeup, the glossed lips that never faltered even in the presence of death, and I realized she had underestimated the woman who cleaned her son's knees after his first fall, who survived a marriage that weathered layoffs, miscarriages, betrayal, and illness, who held her husband's head as he struggled to breathe in the last week of his life. She thought age whittles a woman down to something fragile and malleable, but she has no idea that loss burns away fear and leaves only bone and instinct. I nodded then, not because I believed her, but because I understood something important. Whatever had happened, it wasn't finished. People who steal always leave a seam to tug, a corner of truth sticking out where they failed to tuck it neatly. And I, old or not, have never been afraid of pulling threads. When I left the funeral home that day, my feet were unsteady, but my mind was blisteringly clear. The ring was gone, and someone thought they could bury the evidence along with my husband. But they forgot one thing about old women like me. We've spent our whole lives being underestimated, and that means we've had a lifetime to learn how to watch. And I had seen enough to know the story wasn't over, not for them, and certainly not for me. They told me it was a misunderstanding, a harmless mix-up, the kind of small administrative error that happens during emotional days when minds are fogged and hearts are heavy. But I have lived long enough to know the precise weight of a lie, disguised as mercy. The catalyst, the moment everything shifted from uneasy suspicion to cold certainty, came 2 days after the burial, when I returned to the funeral home because something inside me refused to settle. I told them I needed to retrieve my husband's wedding band for sentimental reasons, though what I really wanted was to look them in the eye while they tried to explain how a $4 million ring simply disappeared into the earth. The young receptionist, with her trembling smile, paged the director, who appeared with the forced solemnity of a man who practices empathy in the mirror, but never quite gets it right. He ushered me into a cramped room lined with filing cabinets that hummed faintly like bees behind their metal skin, and he began with condolences that sounded polished from repetition. I listened, hands folded in my lap like they expected an elderly widow to sit, but inside I was sharp, balanced, ready. When he finally addressed the matter of the ring, he cleared his throat and launched into a pre-written speech about honoring last wishes, about respecting the spiritual symbolism of parting with treasured items, about ensuring the deceased's dignity. I let him talk himself into a corner. Then I asked, with a calmness that seemed to unsettle him, who had provided this supposed wish. He hesitated, eyes flickering just slightly, an involuntary betrayal of someone who knows the story he is about to tell will not withstand scrutiny. He said my daughter-in-law had relayed the request. My daughter-in-law, who had never once discussed anything of sentimental or legal importance with my husband. He kept glancing toward the hallway, as if waiting for someone to rescue him, but no one came. He tried to assure me that everything had been done tastefully, honorably, following protocol, but there was a sweat stain forming under his collar, and he kept smoothing his tie as though pulling himself together might make his words sound truer. I asked again, gently this time, why he allowed a ring of such magnitude to be placed on the deceased without verifying its provenance. His jaw tightened. He began to talk about trusting the family's wishes. I reminded him that I was family, the only one who had shared a bed, a life, a history with the man now lying beneath fresh soil. His facade began to crack, not loudly, but in small ways. An unnecessary swallow, fingers tugging at his cufflink, a darting look to the side when I mentioned security procedures. That was when I brought up the matter of cameras. I said it conversationally, as if asking about the weather, though I knew it would land like a hammer. I told him that every funeral home I had ever visited, and at my age I have visited too many, keeps cameras in preparation rooms for liability. I watched the truth wash the color from his face. Cameras meant accountability. Cameras meant record. Cameras meant the story he rehearsed would stand side by side with reality, and reality rarely flatters liars. He tried to recover quickly, backpedaling with a flimsy explanation that the cameras in that particular room had been offline for maintenance. It was too quick, too prepared, and too obviously false. I did not argue. I simply tilted my head, the way I used to when my son lied about taking money from my purse as a teenager, and asked him to show me the maintenance log. He couldn't. He made excuses about misplaced keys, about the technician not being available, about system outages. I listened to every excuse, stacking them silently like stones, building a wall of inconsistency so tall that even he seemed to hear the echo of his own dishonesty bouncing back at him. When I stood to leave, he reached out too quickly, almost grabbing my arm, then pulling back as though remembering he shouldn't touch the grieving elderly widow. He said he would check into the matter, that he would call me tomorrow. I told him there was no need. He asked, confused, "Why not?" I gave him the truth he had been dodging. Because I already know the ring wasn't his, and I know who took it. His eyes widened before he masked them with a strained professionalism, but the moment was enough. Panic, brief and sharp, had flashed across his features. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting my lungs. The parking lot was almost empty except for a delivery truck and a few wilting flower arrangements leaning against a dumpster. I stood there for a moment, steadying myself against the weight of what I had confirmed, not through confession, but through the unmistakable choreography of guilt. My son and his wife had orchestrated the theft. The funeral director had been complicit. They had counted on my grief to fog my mind, on my age to blunt my instincts, on my politeness to keep me quiet. They believed, truly believed, that I would never question their actions, that I would accept whatever story they fed me, and shuffle along like a woman too broken to see the shape of betrayal. As I walked toward my car, slow but certain, I realized at this moment their smug certainty in my ignorance was the true catalyst, not the missing ring, not the lies, not even the burial itself. It was the brutal clarity of understanding that the people I had loved, fed, supported, saved, and forgiven had finally revealed what they saw when they looked at me. Not a mother, not a widow, not a woman of intellect or experience, but a frail inconvenience who could be manipulated with soft voices and half-truths. They believed I would fade quietly into the background of their clean, curated lives. They believed they had written the ending of this story, but as I gripped the steering wheel and started the engine, I felt something old and strong awaken in me, something forged through years of sacrifice, loss, and resilience. Their theft had not broken me. It had clarified me. And an older woman with clarity is far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. Anything as ugly as a direct refusal. After the funeral home incident, I waited a full day before calling my son, not out of hesitation, but to give him the chance to do what any decent child would do on his own, check on his mother, ask how she was holding up, offer help, or at the very least pretend to care. He didn't call. Not that morning, not that night, not even a text. It was the kind of silence that is louder than words, the kind that twists into you like a cold wind seeping through a cracked window, making everything feel slightly colder than it should. By the time I dialed his number, I already knew the call wouldn't go well, but even I wasn't prepared for the cheerful tone he used when he finally answered, as if we were discussing a brunch reservation instead of a dead husband and a stolen ring. He said he'd been so busy dealing with paperwork and end-of-life logistics, and his voice carried that thin veneer of irritation he used to get as a teenager when I asked whether he'd finished his homework. When I mentioned the ring directly, he sighed in that dismissive, theatrical way that said, without words, that I was the problem, not the missing $4 million asset. He told me gently, as if breaking bad news to a confused patient, that I must be misremembering, that stress affects memory in older adults, that grief makes objects seem more significant than they were. My hand tightened around the phone so hard I could hear the faint creak of plastic, but I didn't interrupt him. I listened to him talk himself into the lie, layering soft condescension over his own panic until he finally said he had to go because the baby had woken up and Caroline can't do everything herself. I didn't correct him about her name. I stopped, caring how he dressed up the reality of her nature long ago. Instead, I let him hang up without answering because I wanted the weight of silence to settle on him for once. I sat in my husband's old armchair afterward, the one that still smelled faintly of his aftershave if I pressed my cheek against the fabric, and I felt the shift in my bones. There's a moment when disbelief ends and resolve begins, and it is rarely dramatic. It's quiet. It's the moment you stop expecting decency. I realized that if I waited for my son to do the right thing, I would wait until the last shovel of dirt covered my own coffin. So instead of grieving the son I thought I had, I began taking practical steps with the steadiness of a woman who has spent her entire life having her competence underestimated. The next day, I went through my file cabinet, the one no one ever asked about because they assumed anything I kept was sentimental clutter. I found the appraisal papers, the insurance documentation, the photographs taken the day we bought the ring, my signature repeating on line after line like a physical echo of all the responsibility I had carried. I laid everything out on the dining table, turning that quiet room into a war map of motives, timelines, and truths. I examined each document with the clinical detachment I once used when sorting through hospital paperwork in the years when my husband's health had been failing. I remembered how even then I was the one who understood the fine print, the one who noticed when a doctor scribbled something vague or a clerk misfiled a lab report. People think age dulls the mind, but the truth is more complicated. Age trims away the unnecessary, leaving only the instinct to survive and the desire to be treated with dignity. By noon, I had already made 3 calls, first to the insurance company, asking in a calm tone that betrayed none of the storm inside me about the process for reporting a stolen item. The representative, a young woman with a soft, sympathetic voice, told me the claim could be opened immediately, and all I needed was supporting documentation. I told her documentation was not a problem. She asked if I had reason to believe the ring had been taken maliciously, and I replied that maliciousness was not the right word. Premeditated opportunism fit better. She didn't laugh, but she understood, and she spoke to me with a respect that felt like a balm on a bruise. The second call was to the funeral home, this time not to the director, but to the corporate office listed on their website. I did not raise my voice. I simply stated, with the clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose, that a valuable item had been unlawfully removed, and I expected a full internal investigation. The woman on the line grew increasingly polite as she asked for details, and I knew that somewhere in the background, a protocol she rarely used had been activated. The third call, the one that marked the true beginning of the quiet escalation, was far simpler. I dialed the number of a reputable attorney whose name my husband had mentioned years ago. He was a man my husband trusted, the kind who handled wills and estates with the same care he used in speaking to elderly clients. When he answered, his voice carried the warmth of familiarity, though he had only met me twice. I explained the situation, choosing my words carefully, making sure to sound neither frantic nor accusatory, just factual, something liars always find unnerving. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said in a low, even tone that he wanted to review everything personally. "It's better you come see me in person," he added, as though he already understood that people had begun to treat me like a fragile inconvenience. I thanked him, hung up, and felt something shift in the air around me, something that felt like a first step on solid ground. After the calls, I made myself tea. Earl Grey, steeped too long because I forgot the timer, and sat at the kitchen table staring out the window. My backyard looked smaller than I remembered, the fence a little more weathered, the hydrangeas withering in the late-season chill. But I didn't feel small. If anything, I felt something expanding inside me, something I hadn't touched in years. The old spine of determination that had carried me through miscarriages, bills, funerals, and sleepless nights sitting beside my husband's hospital bed. That determination, softened by time but never extinguished, began to uncoil again. I could feel it in the steadiness of my hands, in the focus of my thoughts, in the way the world suddenly seemed sharper at the edges. Later that evening, my daughter-in-law sent a text message, short and sweet, asking if I was feeling all right today. It was the kind of message someone sends when they fear they've left a loose thread in a tapestry they'd rather not unravel. I didn't reply. Instead, I let the blue light of the screen fade into darkness, knowing that silence, when used correctly, can be a scalpel. A few hours later, my son called again, his voice tight, almost anxious. He asked how I was, whether I needed anything, whether I was planning to come by soon. I could hear the forced lightness in his tone, the effort to sound casual, and I realized he wasn't checking on me. He was checking on the narrative he hoped I would adopt. I told that night I locked the paperwork in my desk, the same way I used to lock away my son's report cards when he didn't want to face his own failures. Only this time, the roles had reversed. I was the one holding truths he wished would stay hidden, the one gathering evidence, the one preparing out of necessity rather than emotion. I went to bed not with peace, but with clarity, a clarity that felt like a slow flame warming a room after a long winter. They had underestimated me. They always had. And now, step by step, silence by silence, the ground beneath them had begun to shift, and they didn't even realize they were already losing their balance. The shift didn't happen with a grand revelation or a sudden burst of courage, but with something far quieter, almost domestic in its simplicity, the way a pot of water begins to simmer, long before the bubbles break the surface. I woke one morning with that heavy, aching awareness that grief leaves behind, an awareness that feels like a stone pressing against the lungs. And yet something in me refused to stay in bed, refused to remain in the suspended, fragile state my son and his wife seemed so eager to keep me in. I rose slowly, every joint protesting, but there was a steadiness to my steps that hadn't been there for weeks. It was as if my body remembered something my mind had forgotten, that survival is often a matter of standing up, even when you'd rather collapse. I made coffee, burnt toast, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the stack of documents I'd gathered the day before. They were arranged neatly: insurance appraisal, photographs, bank statements, email printouts, even my husband's old handwritten note joking about haunting anyone who tried to bury him with valuables. That tenderness only strengthened my resolve. Something in the morning light made everything clearer. The world outside looked unchanged. The same cracked sidewalk, the same overgrown hedge my husband always meant to trim. But I felt different, stronger, anchored, as though I had stepped into a version of myself I hadn't needed for years. I showered, dressed in my navy coat, the one that still held the faint scent of cedar, and drove to the attorney's office with a deliberate calm that surprised even me. But grief wasn't muddying anything anymore. It was clarifying it, carving away the illusions I had held on to about my son, about the people I trusted, and even about the woman I thought I had become in my old age. I wasn't faded or confused. I was awake. When I stepped into the attorney's office, the air smelled faintly of old books and citrus polish. The receptionist greeted me by name, her eyes warm and unpitying, and that small dignity made my throat tighten with gratitude. The attorney, a graying man with eyes that missed nothing, ushered me into his office with the familiarity of someone who had known my husband well. He didn't rush me, didn't speak to me like a delicate relic. He simply listened. I told him everything, every whisper, every glance, every strange silence, every piece of missing truth. His expression hardened little by little, not with anger but with confirmation, the kind that comes from seeing a picture you hoped wasn't true finally snap into focus. It was a coordinated act with legal consequences, and I had every right to pursue action. But the real shift came afterward, when he walked me through the preliminary steps we could take. It was not vengeance he offered me, nor drama, nor elaborate threats, just procedure, rational and deliberate, a path paved by logic rather than emotion. He explained that I could request access to the funeral home's internal files, that I could demand to see footage they claimed had been under maintenance, that I could submit a formal declaration of theft, that I could freeze any transfer of assets until the matter was resolved. And as he spoke, something inside me loosened, like a knot pulling free after being tightened for too long. For weeks, I had felt cornered by grief and betrayal, but now I saw that I wasn't cornered at all. They were. They had underestimated me so profoundly that they had left dozens of loose threads, and with the attorney's guidance, I could pull each one until the entire fabric of their deception unraveled. On the drive home, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, the kind of calm that settles over a person when they realize they have finally stepped out of someone else's shadows. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a long moment, both hands resting on the steering wheel, watching as the afternoon sun cast long, thin shadows across the yard. My house looked smaller than I remembered, almost unfamiliar, as though I had been away for years instead of days. I walked inside and immediately felt the weight of my husband's absence, the quiet where his voice should have been, the empty groove on the couch cushion where he always sat. But alongside the grief was a new clarity, a new purpose, and it filled the space between my ribs like air after a long dive. When I checked my phone, I saw several missed calls from my son. The voicemails were short, his tone clipped, controlled, trying too hard to sound casual while his words twisted in directions that revealed the tension underneath. He asked where I'd been, whether everything was all right, whether I was keeping busy or handling things okay. They were the kind of questions people ask when they're not interested in the answer, but terrified of the truth. I didn't call him back. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and watched the steam rise in the quiet kitchen. Silence, I realized, had become my ally. Silence unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. That evening, I opened the small wooden box where I kept the last handwritten letter my husband had ever given me. The ink had faded slightly over the years, and the signature dipped at the end where his hand had trembled from medication. I traced the curves of his handwriting with my finger and let myself remember the man he had been, the way he defended me when others were dismissive, the way he always said I was the smartest person he knew, the way he trusted my judgment more than anyone's. He would have hated what had been done to me. He would have hated that I was forced to fight, but he would have wanted me to fight all the same. That thought steadied me. Later, as the sun dipped behind the houses across the street, I felt the changes in me deepen. Something old had returned. Not rage, not bitterness, but a sharpness I thought I'd lost with age. I felt like a woman who had remembered an old version of herself, the version who handled bills when my husband was too sick, who navigated hospitals and insurance agencies and predatory lenders without crumbling, who stood firm in storms far more violent than this. And with that recollection came something else, the knowledge that I wasn't doing this just to reclaim a ring. I was doing it to reclaim myself from the quiet erasure my son and his wife had been tightening around me for years. As night fell, I walked through the house with purpose, gathering everything I needed for the next steps: the folder of documents, the USB drive with digital records, the notebook in which I had begun writing down every odd detail from the past few weeks. I placed everything in my purse, zipped it up, and set it by the front door. I felt the way a person feels when she has packed her bags for a journey she didn't plan, but now knows she must take. Not running away, moving forward. And for the first time since my husband died, I slept without waking in the middle of the night. Not because the grief had softened, but because something else had finally taken its rightful place beside it. Resolve, warm and steady, like a lantern lit at dusk. The pressure began almost imperceptibly, the way a room grows colder long before anyone admits the window has been left open. And at first I thought I was imagining the shift in tone when my son called. The careful way he shaped each sentence as if he were speaking to someone who might break under the weight of too much truth. I had barely set my purse down after returning from the attorney's office when the phone rang, and his voice came through cheerful and bright, that kind of exaggerated brightness people use when they're trying to hide their unease. He asked about my day, about whether I'd eaten, and whether I was resting enough, as though I were a frail stranger instead of the woman who had once held him through night fevers and taught him how to read. When I didn't offer details, he tried again, this time with a strained casualness, asking if I had gone anywhere important. The question hung in the air, heavy with fear disguised as curiosity, and I simply told him that I'd had errands. There was a silence on his end, the kind that reveals far more than words. And though he quickly wrapped the call in platitudes, I could feel the tension like a wire pulled tight between us. The next morning, I woke to an unexpected knock on my door, and when I opened it, my daughter-in-law stood on the porch with a smile that didn't touch her eyes, holding a paper bag of pastries as if they could soften the bruising intentions behind. Her visit. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited and commented on how quiet the house felt, how I must be so lonely, and how she and my son had been thinking it might be better for me to stay with them for a while. The suggestion was delivered in a voice dipped in honey, yet beneath the sweetness lay a sharpness I had grown too familiar with over the years. I asked her why they were suddenly so concerned, and she laughed, a brittle sound, insisting that they simply cared too much to leave me alone in a big house full of memories. But her eyes kept flicking toward the table where I had laid out my documents the night before, and I realized this wasn't a visit of compassion, but reconnaissance. She lingered far too long, drifting from room to room with the deceptive curiosity of a guest, pretending to admire the decor while mentally cataloging the locations of valuables. She commented on my medications, asked pointed questions about whether I had been feeling confused lately, whether I had misplaced anything important, whether I had trouble remembering dates or times. I recognized the tactic immediately, a subtle planting of seeds that could later bloom into allegations of incompetence if they needed to paint me as unstable. I answered with a calmness that unsettled her, refusing to play the part she had scripted for me. And when she finally ran out of excuses to remain, she left quickly, but not before glancing over her shoulder at the locked drawer of my desk with a flash of irritation. It was later that same afternoon when the first letter arrived from the funeral home, addressed to me in a tone so formally apologetic it might have fooled someone less perceptive. They informed me that, after a comprehensive review, they had found no evidence of misconduct and that all personal items had been handled according to standard procedures. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it beside the phone. The speed of their response alone betrayed their desperation. No investigation of substance could have been completed in less than 24 hours. Their lies had become clumsy, hurried, stitched together by the trembling hands of people who realized they had underestimated the resilience of an old woman who refused to be erased. By evening, my son arrived without calling first, using his spare key to let himself into my home as though it still belonged to him. He walked through the door with the forced confidence of a man trying to appear unbothered, and yet his eyes darted immediately to the documents on the table, his jaw tightening just slightly. He said he was worried, that he had heard from his wife that I'd been acting strangely, and that he wanted to check on my well-being. I watched him choose each word carefully, constructing a narrative in which he was the responsible caretaker and I was the fragile dependent in need of guidance. When he asked, with exaggerated softness, whether I had spoken to anyone outside the family recently, I felt a subtle shift in the room, as if the air had thickened with the weight of his expectations. I told him that I had spoken to my husband's attorney, and his composure cracked for the briefest second, a flash of panic crossing his features before he masked it with a poorly timed laugh. He insisted I was overreacting, that the ring was of sentimental value only, that I must have misunderstood his wife's intentions at the funeral home, and that I was letting grief make mountains out of shadows. He reached for my hands, squeezing them with a staged tenderness, but there was tension in his grip, a plea buried beneath the performance. I gently pulled my hands away and told him that adults who have nothing to hide do not panic when asked simple questions. His eyes hardened then, losing their veneer of warmth, and he made one last attempt to regain control by suggesting, almost casually, that perhaps it was time to discuss power of attorney, just to make sure things run smoothly during this difficult period. When I told him no, he didn't argue, but the silence that followed was colder than any winter I'd ever lived through. 2 days later, the first legal letter arrived, not from my attorney, but from one hired by my son and his wife. It was an elegantly written document, filled with phrases designed to intimidate, subtly implying that my accusations could be considered defamatory, that I might be misinterpreting events due to emotional distress, and that any further claims could result in unfortunate legal consequences. The letter was a masterpiece of veiled threats wrapped in faux concern, the kind of letter that assumes the receiver is too frightened or too confused to read between the lines. I read it slowly, letting each sentence settle into place like a puzzle piece revealing the picture of their desperation. They wanted me quiet. They wanted me malleable. They wanted me to step back into the role of the docile mother who accepted whatever version of the truth they handed her. But I had been docile for too long. The next escalation came from the funeral home, this time by phone. A representative called to inform me that, regrettably, the camera footage from the preparation room was unavailable due to technical malfunctions, but they hoped I would take comfort in knowing their staff had acted with the utmost respect. When I asked for specifics, the representative stumbled through vague explanations, her tone increasingly flustered as I continued to press for clarity. Finally, she suggested that, given my age and circumstances, perhaps my recollection of events was not entirely reliable. The implication settled over me like a bitter fog. They were aligning their story with my son's, constructing a narrative of fragility and confusion so they could dismiss me without guilt. Yet what they hadn't accounted for was that every attempt to silence me only sharpened my resolve. Each lie, each patronizing phrase, each calculated insult to my intelligence became another stepping stone toward the confrontation they feared most. I began writing down every conversation in a notebook, dates, times, exact phrasing, because documentation is the language liars fear. I saved every letter, every voicemail, every text message dripping with false concern. I noticed cars parked near my house that I had never seen before, and though I couldn't prove they were watching me, the timing felt too convenient to dismiss as coincidence. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses and cast long shadows across my living room, I received a message from an unknown number. It read, "Stop pursuing this. It's not worth the trouble." No signature, no explanation, just that flat, chilling command. I stared at the words for a long moment, the glow of the screen reflecting off the framed photograph of my husband on the mantel. I imagined him standing beside me, shaking his head in that slow, knowing way he used to when someone underestimated me. I deleted nothing. I saved everything. The final straw arrived the next morning when my daughter-in-law appeared again, this time without pastries or false smiles. She stood in my doorway with her arms crossed, her gaze sharp and unrestrained, and she told me bluntly that I was causing unnecessary distress to the family. She said the children were confused, that my accusations were tearing them apart, that I was choosing greed over harmony, and that perhaps I was not in the best state to make decisions on my own. Her voice rose as she spoke, slipping out of its usual polished restraint, revealing the frustration simmering beneath months, perhaps years, of carefully controlled resentment. When she finally paused for breath, I asked her calmly whether she had enjoyed the ring, whether it had felt as heavy on her conscience as it had on her hand. She paled, her lips twitched, and for the first time, she couldn't find a lie quick enough to cover the truth showing through her expression. That was when I knew the second escalation had reached its peak. Not because they were winning, but because they were losing control of their narrative. They were scrambling now, throwing accusations like drowning people clutching at anything to stay afloat. And in their desperation, they had forgotten the most important truth of all, that an old woman with nothing left to fear is far more dangerous than they ever imagined. And I, standing there in my own doorway, watching the last remnants of their composure crumble, felt something rise in me, not anger, not vengeance, but certainty. The story they were trying to suffocate had already begun to breathe on its own, and no amount of pressure, intimidation, or deceit would make me abandon the truth that was unfolding with every passing hour. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind of morning where the sky hangs low and gray over the neighborhood, pressing down with the weight of something unspoken. I had barely finished pouring my tea when the knock came, firm and impatient. the kind of knock that doesn't ask permission, but demands obedience. When I opened the door, a man in a tidy suit stood there with a padded envelope in one hand and a stiff expression on his face, and before I could speak, he said my name in that clipped legal tone that reduces identities to file numbers. He handed me the envelope without ceremony, offered a thin, reluctant nod, and returned to a car I didn't recognize, its tinted windows swallowing him like a secret. Inside the envelope was a letter from the funeral home's corporate legal team, thick with formal language meant to intimidate and overwhelm. They insisted again on their innocence, asserted that their staff had acted with professionalism, claimed the missing footage had been irretrievably lost due to a catastrophic systems failure, and warned that continued accusations could result in legal action. But there, beneath the stiff legal posturing, was something else, a quiet panic bleeding through the polished phrases, the unmistakable tremor of people who understood they were finally cornered. They tried to shield themselves behind bureaucracy, but the more they insisted on the impossibility of wrongdoing, the more obvious their desperation became. I set the letter down and felt something inside me harden with a clarity that had been growing for weeks. Not an hour later, my son called again, his voice pitched higher than usual, breathless, as if he had been pacing while waiting for me to answer. He didn't bother with feigned warmth this time. Instead, he launched into a frantic insistence that I stop pursuing the matter, that I reconsider my claims before everything became messy, that the attorney I had contacted was not looking out for my interests, and that the stress of all this was dangerous at my age. I listened to him unravel, his sentences tripping over each other, the illusion of control slipping through his fingers with every word. When I calmly told him that I knew exactly what I was doing, the line went silent. So silent I thought the call had dropped. Then his voice was steady, but I could hear the restrained energy beneath it when he told me that he had secured a court order granting access to the funeral home's internal records. He asked if I could come to his office the next morning, and when I asked why, he paused long enough to make my pulse quicken. Because I wandered through the house, touching the back of my husband's armchair, running my fingers across the wood of the dining table he had polished every spring, pausing in front of the photograph of us taken on the day we bought the ring together. In that picture, we were younger, tired but proud, holding each other with the kind of intimacy that comes from surviving every disappointment and celebrating every small miracle together. I whispered to that photograph that I was doing this for both of us, for all the years we spent building a life that others assumed they had the right to dismantle once our backs were turned. The night was long and heavy, but I didn't feel afraid. I felt ready. When I walked into the attorney's office the next morning, he greeted me not with polite professionalism, but with the sober respect a person offers someone who has endured more than most could bear. He motioned for me to sit, then placed a stack of printed documents on the table between us. At the top was a time-stamped still image from the funeral home's internal surveillance system, the very footage they had sworn was lost. I stared at the grainy photograph, and my breath caught when I saw my daughter-in-law in the preparation room, leaning over my husband's body, her hand closing around something small and glinting. Behind her stood a funeral home employee, his posture tense, his eyes fixed on the doorway as if afraid of being caught. The next image showed her slipping the ring into her coat pocket, her expression composed, almost serene, as though she were performing a mundane task rather than stealing something sacred. The funeral home had handed the footage over reluctantly after being presented with the court order and the threat of a full investigation into their practices. My attorney slid the rest of the packet toward me, and as I flipped through the pages, the truth unfolded in crisp black and white paragraphs. internal emails discussing the client's valuable property, warnings from staff about the impropriety of removing personal items without documentation, and a final message from the funeral director instructing the team to resolve the matter quietly. Every piece was a confession, written in their own careful words, the facade of professionalism crumbling under the weight of their own negligence. My hands trembled, not with shock, but with the fierce satisfaction of a confirmation. For weeks they had tried to make me doubt myself, tried to convince me I was imagining things, tried to manipulate my grief into something malleable and harmless. But here, in my hands, was the unvarnished truth they had fought so hard to hide. The attorney looked at me with a solemn nod, acknowledging not only the gravity of the evidence, but the strength it had taken for me to reach this moment. Once I had seen everything, he asked whether I wanted to pursue criminal charges. The question hung in the air like a test, a measure of how far I was willing to go. I closed the packet slowly and told him that what I wanted more than anything was to reclaim what was mine and to ensure that those who had betrayed me understood that I was not a woman who could be pushed into silence. He assured me that the funeral home would be contacted immediately and that the legal repercussions for their actions and for the actions of the person who worked with them would be unavoidable. That afternoon, as the gray light filtered through the windows of my living room, a courier arrived at my door carrying a small velvet box. The label bore the funeral home's corporate seal, and the courier, unable to meet my eyes, handed the package to me with the stiff posture of someone delivering a verdict. When I opened the box, there it was, the ring, gleaming with the same quiet dignity it had carried the day we bought it. It looked heavier somehow, as if it had absorbed the weight of every lie, every betrayal, every attempt to erase my voice. I held it in my palm for a long time, feeling the cool metal warm under my skin, and I realized that reclaiming it wasn't the victory. The victory was standing in my own doorway, unbroken, with the truth shining in my hand like a small, fierce flame. They had tried to bury my husband with that ring, believing they could bury the truth with it, believing I would never notice, never question, never fight. But I had noticed, I had questioned, I had fought. And I had won, not through bitterness or vengeance, but through the simple, steady refusal to be dismissed. When I finally placed the ring in my safe, locking it away not out of fear but out of respect, I felt a stillness settle inside me, a sense of closure that had nothing to do with the ring itself and everything to do with the woman I had remembered how to be. They thought they could silence me. They forgot that I learned how to speak long before they learned how to lie. When everything was finally over, when the papers were signed, the emails archived, the ring locked safely in the quiet darkness of my safe, I found myself standing in the middle of my living room in a kind of silence I hadn't felt since before grief settled itself across my shoulders. It wasn't the hollow, echoing silence of loss, nor the sharp silence of fear, nor the tense, coiled silence of waiting. It was something calmer, something steadier, as if the walls themselves had exhaled after holding their breath for weeks. For the first time since the funeral, the house didn't feel like a battlefield or an interrogation room or a museum of everything I had nearly lost. It felt like my home again, a place where I could sit without watching the shadows for threats, a place where I could breathe freely without bracing for another blow. My son didn't come by after the truth surfaced, and he didn't call either. Instead, he sent a message drafted with the brittle politeness of someone who has lost the right to intimacy but doesn't want to admit it. He said he needed time to process everything, as though the betrayal needed contemplation rather than remorse, and suggested that, Distance might be healthy for everyone. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He didn't ask how I was doing or whether I needed anything. And strangely, that absence, that clean severing of pretense, felt like a relief rather than a wound. For years, I had held on to some small hope that the boy I raised was still inside the man he had become. But the truth had stripped away the illusion, and I saw clearly that some distances are not tragedies. They are boundaries finally drawing themselves where they always should have been. My daughter-in-law said even less. She sent one curt message asking me to remember the children in all this, a phrase that carried the faint, stale scent of manipulation. And when I didn't reply, she sent nothing further. I imagine she is furious, pacing their picture-perfect kitchen, crafting stories in her mind that cast her as the misunderstood victim. But I no longer feel the need to correct her narratives or defend myself against them. Some people need to believe in their own righteousness so desperately that truth feels like violence to them, and there is no point in offering clarity to those who fear it more than they fear their own cruelty. In the days that followed, the funeral home's corporate office issued a settlement, a long, impersonal document filled with promises of improved procedures and retraining, but not a single handwritten apology, not a single acknowledgement of the sacred line they had crossed. I accepted their resolution because I didn't need their remorse. The truth had already done its work, and I had no desire to prolong my entanglement with people who treated dignity as a negotiable commodity. I left the packet on my dining table for a day before filing it away, and when I did, it felt like closing the door on something rotten and airless. With the external battles finished, the internal ones began to soften too. Sometimes I still walked into the living room expecting to see my husband's chair occupied, expecting to hear him humming the way he used to when lost in thought. And each time the emptiness stung a little, but it no longer felt like a blade, twisting. It felt like a bruise healing, tender, but no longer raw. One morning, I took the ring out of the safe, not to wear it, not to admire its value, but to hold it, to remind myself of everything it represented beyond the weight of its gold. It was never just a jewel or an investment. It was the embodiment of the life my husband and I built together. The years of sacrifice and quiet courage, the dreams we carried, even when the world felt too heavy. Holding it again, reclaimed and protected, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself too, a piece I had almost allowed others to redefine or diminish. I placed it back in the safe gently, not as a possession, but as a promise. That afternoon, as I sat by the window with a cup of lukewarm tea, watching the neighbor's dog chase sparrows across the yard, I felt something settle inside me, a stillness that wasn't resignation, but acceptance. Not the acceptance of injustice, but the acceptance that I had done what I needed to do, that I had honored myself in a world that often forgets to honor women like me. I thought of all the older women I've known, women who swallowed their anger, silenced their doubts, handed over their autonomy in the hope of keeping peace, only to find that peace built on silence is a fragile, cracking thing. I thought of how easily I could have slipped into that same quiet compliance, how easily I could have let them bury not just the ring, but the truth, and how grateful I was to the woman inside me who refused to go gentle. If another woman like me were sitting across from me now, someone with years pressed into her bones, someone who has been told too many times that age makes her weak, I would tell her this: there will always be people who mistake your softness for frailty, who interpret your quiet for confusion, who try to rewrite your story because they assume you have no voice left to protest. But the truth is, that age sharpens more than it dulls. It reveals the core of who you are, and at the core of every older woman I have ever known is a strength that terrifies those who rely on her silence. I would tell her that she has every right to fight for what is hers, every right to demand respect, every right to outgrow the roles others try to force her into. And I would tell her that reclaiming yourself is not loud or dramatic. It is steady, deliberate, and entirely yours. As the sun dipped behind the houses that evening, casting long, honey-colored shadows across my kitchen walls, I realized I was finally at peace, not because everything had been restored, but because I had restored myself. The world had tried to shrink me, to make me small enough to ignore, but I refused to disappear. And in that refusal, in that quiet, unyielding stand, I found a version of myself I thought I had lost long ago. A woman who knows her worth, her truth, and her power. And that, more than the ring, more than justice, more than anything else, is what I will carry with me into the rest of my days.